This is Toumani Camara, and it's time to open up the briefcase with Casey Holdahl.
Greetings, Blazer fans, and welcome to The Briefcase, presented by Spirit Mountain Casino. Episode 128 of The Briefcase, presented by Spirit Mountain Casino. I'm your host, Casey Holdahl, and the Portland Trail Blazers still winless on a it will be a 5-game homestand. When it's all completed, at least, they've played 2 games of that homestand, have not won either of those games yet. They had an okay loss to the Heat on Saturday, and then I would say probably a bad loss to the Nets on Tuesday. However, in that loss, both Scoot and Toumani had career nights. It was a loss, though, so hard to kind of celebrate that thing, at least for the individual players, but we can celebrate them here on The Briefcase. And the Trailblazers going into a stretch over this next week and a half, in which they'll play 6 games in 9 days and do a whole lot of flying for playing not all that much basketball, all of which we'll talk about on this edition of The Briefcase, presented by Spirit Mountain Casino. Well, after getting a 5-game homestand off to a start, at least, with a 119-98 loss to the Heat on Saturday, Trailblazers returned to the court on Tuesday and ended up losing to the Brooklyn Nets 132-114 in front of a crowd of about 16,000 people Tuesday night at Moda Center. As I mentioned, those are the first 2 games of a 5-game homestand, and you would hope the Blazers are able to get some of these games on this homestand after playing some pretty decent basketball on the road to start 2025, though they are playing some pretty good teams and their schedule is getting pretty difficult here. The game versus the Nets was one of the games that you probably figured was the best chance to get a win, but it seems like the Blazers this year, the games where you think they're going to have a better chance, they seem to do more poorly in those games, I would say, generally, than otherwise. Maybe that's just anecdotal from me, but it feels to me that the Blazers in games versus teams that are kind of around them in the standings, those seem to be some of the games where the Blazers have some of their worst performances, and I would say that was probably the case on Tuesday night. The Heat game actually felt closer, I felt like, than the final score indicated. The Nets game, to me, actually felt worse than the final score indicated. The Blazers never led in that game. I think they were tied once, but other than that, a wire-to-wire loss to the Brooklyn Nets, who a team that, has more talent now than they did couple weeks ago, but still not a team that's blown the doors off or anything, and is missing quite a few guys as well. But we're still able to get a rather comfortable victory versus the Trailblazers on their home court. As I mentioned, Blazers never led. They were only down 6 going into the second half, and so at that point in time, you're like, well, they're only down 6, like, they got a chance in this one. But about midway through the third quarter, the Nets went up by about 12, and I think maybe one other time the Blazers got it to under single digits. So basically the entire second half game, at least at double digits, and really just never really looked like they were going to get over the top in that game. It was kind of the similar situation with the Heat in that, the Blazers, they got down twice in that game versus the Heat and kind of rallied both times. But every time it seemed like they were within like 5 to 8 points, the Heat would score 8 straight, and that would be kind of the end of that run. Kind of felt the same way versus the Nets. Anytime the Blazers got it even kind of close, particularly in the first half, Nets would go on a run. Blazers really didn't get it all that close at any point in time in the second half, so you really can't even say that. So a bit disappointing there. That's a game where you would like to have at least been more competitive, if not actually get a win. And the Blazers were not able to do that, despite getting some very good nights from both Scoot Henderson and Toumani Camara. Scoot Henderson made his first 8 shots, including his first 6 3-point attempts, on the way to setting a new career high in scoring of 39 points. Should have gotten 40. Starting in place of Denny Advia, who has an ankle sprain right now. Scoot ended up going 13 of 18 from the field and 8 of 10 from 3, which is fantastic for Scoot, along with 5 of 8 from the free throw line, while also logging 6 assists, 4 rebounds, and 2 steals in 38 minutes. Easily, particularly in terms of scoring, in terms of shooting, probably Scoot's best game as a pro. Again, a lot of those shots, 3-point shots, and that's been an area that Scoot has really been working on and has needed to improve upon. And at least in the game versus the Brooklyn Nets, he absolutely did. Some notes from our Portland Trail Blazers PR staff. Scoot Henderson is the 25th player in NBA history at the age of 20 or younger to score at least 39 points in a game. So throughout the entire history of the NBA, for players 20 years or younger, Scoot is just one of 25 players to ever score at least 39 points in a game. It's kind of interesting. Among second-year players this season, only Victor Wembanyama has scored more points in a game than Scoot Henderson's 39 versus the Nets on Tuesday. Henderson's 8 of 10 three-point shooting performance is tied for the second best single game three-point percentage in Trailblazers history among players who attempted at least 10 threes in a game. Now we're starting to get a little weird with the qualifiers here, but that's what you're supposed to do. Henderson is the 11th Trailblazer in team history to make at least 8 three-pointers in a game. According to Tom Haberstroh, I also believe that Scoot is the youngest player in Trailblazers history to have a game with at least 8 three-pointers. They didn't put that one out there, and age stuff is kind of hard to figure out sometimes, but Tom knows that stuff as well as anyone, so I would definitely take his word for it. So one of the best young performances for a Trailblazer, at least shooting from three, which, and too, like, again, Scoot is not a three-point shooter. So the fact that he was able to go 8 of 10 from three, he kind of had it going, or maybe that shows that kind of some of the work he's been putting in is starting to pay off. Chauncey Billups did say that Scoot had a really good practice on Monday going into that game on Tuesday. And so that might have helped. I also think getting the start probably helped Scoot as well. And finally, Scoot's 18 field goal attempts on Tuesday are the fewest field goal attempts needed by a Trailblazer to reach 39 points in a game since January 15th, 2023, and that was Damian Lillard. Basically, any stat that has to do with scoring, high scoring, three-pointers, is basically Damian Lillard's stat in terms of the Portland Trailblazers. So good to see Scoot get in there as well. So a very nice night for Scoot, at least offensively. It would have been nice if it would have come in a win, but nevertheless, Scoot getting a chance to start in place of Denny Advia, who I would not be surprised if he was going to miss maybe at least another game with that ankle injury. Hopefully it's not too serious, but I would actually be almost a little surprised if he played on Thursday in the game versus the Clippers. We'll have to wait for the injury report on that. We did get some other injury news, unfortunately, which we'll get to here in a second. But Scoot, as I mentioned, not the only Trailblazer that had a career night versus the Nets on Tuesday. Toumani Camara also set a career high with 23 points to go along with 5 rebounds, 2 assists, 2 steals, and 2 blocks in 38 minutes. Toumani did that, I believe, on 30 or 21 shots, which has probably got to be a career high for attempts for Toumani as well. Only hit 7 of those 21 shots, but he did go 4 of 11 from 3, which helped, and made all 5 of his free throw attempts. I think at this point, too, you look at Toumani and Denny as the two guys on this team who have probably made the most progress this year, or at least giving you the most cause for optimism going forward. I think some of the stuff we've seen from Shaedon is great. I think obviously the stuff we've seen from Donovan, particularly early on in the season, some really good stuff there as well. But I think the combination of both Denny and Toumani, what both those guys bring to that lineup, I think has really been one of the best things, if not the best thing, for the Trailblazers this season. Which, like to get Toumani in that trade to bring DA over from Phoenix, again, not a throw-in because that's a guy that they liked. But for all the stuff that the Dame deal and the Nurk deal, all told at this point, the two I think things that you feel best about in that trade at this point are getting Toumani and then being able to use Malcolm Brogdon and a pick to get Denny from Washington. So I think both of those moves have really paid off for the Trailblazers. I think you feel really good about those things going forward. Not to say that the other guys haven't performed well or given you something you've needed, but I just think at least in terms of kind of what expectations were compared to what the reality has been, I think both Denny and Toumani really doing a great job and really showing that those moves made a lot of sense for the Trailblazers and really guys who I think you can assume are going to be part of this team long-term going forward. As I mentioned, unfortunately, there was some injury news in that game. Donovan Clingan came off the bench, grabbed 14 rebounds in the game versus the Nets, but suffered what looks like an ankle injury late in the game. Actually, the team put out an update this afternoon saying that Donovan Clingan was evaluated on Wednesday after the injury on Tuesday and has been diagnosed with a mild left ankle sprain. He will be reevaluated in 1 week, and they say they will give a timeline when appropriate. So Donovan out for at least the next week. Meaning that, he will obviously not play in any of the games to finish out this homestand, 3 remaining games of this homestand this week. And guessing that means he probably won't play at least versus the Heat in that game in Miami. I believe that's on Tuesday. His status for the games versus the Magic and the Hornets, I think, are probably more up in the air with that 1 week timeline. But obviously, it depends on how he reacts to treatment. I imagine he probably will travel with the team regardless. But either way, you're going to be without Donovan for at least a week. which is unfortunate. After he had that MCL injury, he's come back and I think it's taken a little bit of time to get back into the swing of things, a little time to get back into the flow and get his fitness back. But he's looked really good in the last couple games, so really unfortunate for him to have that ankle injury. It looked like he maybe had a little bit of a knee injury early on in the game, ended up coming back, ended up playing. And then again, at the very end of the game, rolled that ankle, and now it sounds like he's going to be out for at least a week. And again, that's one of those things too where this is it's a mild ankle sprain, so not a significant injury, but he is a young player. He is a 7'3" huge person. He's already had that MCL issue this year. He's had a foot issue when he was at UConn. All that to say, I would not at all be surprised if they went real slow with Donovan's return to play. Again, I mean, he's a guy who always wants to play, so like I think he probably pushes a little bit more on that than maybe some other guys might. But I would imagine at this point that they're really going to want to make sure they're not putting him in a situation where he's uncomfortable or is going to chance an injury. They obviously have DA. Rob Williams has missed a couple games with various injuries and illness, but I imagine at least that he'll be back. I believe his designation for the Nets game, which he did not play, was illness. It's been going around the entire team, so hopefully that's nothing too serious, and hopefully he's able to play in these games the rest of the week in this homestand. And if not, Duop Aretha is obviously available to go. He played some minutes recently as well. So Donovan Clingan out for at least a week. I would imagine it'll probably be at least a little bit longer than that as well. And the team has put out an injury report for Thursday's game versus the Clippers. As I mentioned, Donovan Clingan is out for the next week at least with an ankle sprain. Jeremy Grant still out with that face contusion. He hasn't played since, I believe, the 76ers game back in 2024, the last game of 2024 for the Trailblazers on December 30th, if I'm not mistaken. So he's more than 2 weeks out from that injury. It sounds like he's making progress, but still out for the game on Thursday versus the Clippers. Matisse Thybulle also out with a right ankle sprain. It sounds like he is also getting close to returning. So hopefully maybe on this road trip coming up, we might see Matisse again. But if not, I imagine when we get back from that road trip, very good chance you'll see Matisse there if there's no more setbacks. Deni Avdija is listed as doubtful with a right ankle sprain, and Robert Williams III is listed as doubtful with an illness. So the Blazers conceivably down 5 players in that game Thursday night versus the Clippers. So not great news there. You would hope that maybe Denny or Rob is able to play in that game, if not both. But if not, Blazers down to 10 guys at that point in time, plus the two-way guys. So getting a little lean again for the Portland Trailblazers. Hopefully some of these guys able to come back soon. As I mentioned, Trailblazers have 3 more home games remaining before they head back out on the road here at the beginning of next week. And if you're looking for a place to enjoy some Trailblazers games, why don't you check out Spirit Mountain Casino on Highway 18 in Grand Ronde. Spirit Mountain Casino features close to 2,000 of the latest slots, including fan favorites like Buffalo, Cleopatra, and Zeus. Whether into traditional slots or progressive jackpots, Spirit Mountain Casino is there to elevate your game. You can also place sports bets at Spirit Mountain Casino as well, both for the pros and for college. I think it has the college football playoff. Is it still going? Yeah, I don't know when that's happening. It's Ohio State, Notre Dame, I believe. After Oregon lost, I kind of checked out on things, and Blazers schedule's too busy. Anyways, you can't bet college on the Oregon Lottery sports betting app that's done through DraftKings, but you can bet college at Spirit Mountain Casino. So if you're looking for a place to put some action down on that championship game, Spirit Mountain Casino is your place to go. Obviously, taking bets for the NBA and NFL as well. So you got slots, you got sports betting, you got a great hotel, great food options, great place to hang out. Spirit Mountain Casino, Highway 18 in Grand Ronde. Elevate your game. Well, after having a really easy schedule in the month of December, Blazers are going to start paying for it now here at the end of January. As I mentioned, Trailblazers have 3 games remaining on this 5-game homestand, but on Thursday versus the Clippers, they start a stretch in which they play 6 games in 9 nights. They got the Clippers on Thursday, that Shade and Sharp glass night, by the way, collectible glass night. Those are really cool glasses. First 7,777 fans in the building get one of those glasses. So if you're looking for a reason to go to the game on Thursday night outside of just watching some basketball, the Shade and Sharp collectible glass is a good reason to do that. So you got the game on Thursday versus the Clippers. Then you got a back-to-back this weekend versus the Rockets and Bulls on Saturday and Sunday. And then a cross-country flight to Miami on Monday to face the Heat on Tuesday. Wednesday off. And then a back-to-back versus the Magic and the Hornets on Thursday and Friday, and then a cross-country flight back home to Portland. So what that means is on that trip, the Blazers will end up taking two cross-country flights, both of them about 5.5, 6 hours. So about 12 hours total in the air to play 144 minutes of basketball, which anytime you're on a plane more than you're actually in the arena for a road trip, that's a bad trip. Uh, Granted, you're going to some Florida is great. Charlotte is an underrated town for sure, but that's a whole lot of flying for not a whole lot of basketball. Usually, that Florida trip, we'd face the Hawks maybe sometime in there. Maybe we'd have a game in Texas on the way back. Maybe Minnesota. That's kind of a common stop on the way back from an East Coast trip as well, particularly a shorter East Coast trip. But not the case this time. So quite a bit of time in the air in order to play three games, which, that's the kind of stuff that's going to happen in an NBA schedule. It's also why, when you have that stretch in December where you played like three games over the course of 15 days, it's nice and it's like, hey, this is great. We got a little time off. We can work on some stuff. We can catch a break a little bit. The NBA schedule, though, you're always going to end up paying that back at some point in time. And now, as I mentioned, the Trailblazers are going to be paying that back in the for until the All-Star break. Portland's schedule gets pretty dense, both in terms of the competition, playing some much better teams here going into these next couple weeks, and the frequency of those games as well. As I mentioned, the Trailblazers entering a stretch where they're playing 6 games in 9 nights, which is quite a few games in not that many nights. And again, against all some pretty good teams as well. And then they return home and have another extended homestand after the game for Charlotte. So they end up playing Oklahoma City, Milwaukee, Damian Lillard game in that one, Orlando, and then 2 against Phoenix, and then another versus Philadelphia, and then 1 versus the Pacers and 1 versus Sacramento. So basically, playing some pretty good teams in the month of February, but they don't basically go on the road in February until right before the All-Star break. So while they are going to be playing more games, at least those games are going to be at home, which is great. Blazers have played some pretty good basketball on the road this year, though. And again, some of their worst losses, I would say all of their worst losses this year, there's 3 that kind of really stick out in my head, have all been at home, which, it's not great. So if nothing else, you would hope that a little bit better performance at home when you're playing some of these teams. Even if you're not getting wins, you at least got to give the fans something to be excited about, even if you're not getting a W that night. So hopefully able to come out and play some pretty good basketball. But they actually, obviously, the back-to-back versus the Rockets and the Bulls this weekend, a pretty big back for the Trailblazers. And then, as I mentioned, leading into a 3-game trip in which they'll be doing a whole lot of flying and playing not a whole lot of basketball, or at least only 3 games worth of basketball versus Eastern Conference opponents. So that's kind of the way the NBA schedule goes. You got the good parts, you got your bad parts, and the Blazers just happen to be entering a section that is one of the bad parts. Well, before we wrap up this actual brief edition of the Briefcase presented by Spirit Mountain Casino, I want to get your betting on the Blazers segment. Since we haven't checked in a minute, Trailblazers are now 20-18-1 versus the spread this season after going 2-2 versus the spread in their last 4 games. They were 2-point dogs versus the Pelicans and won that game by 19. They were 7.5-point dogs versus the Mavericks and lost that game by 6. That's a good one. They were 5-point dogs to the Heat and lost by 21. That's an L. And obviously, they were 3.5-point favorites versus the Nets on Tuesday. Ended up losing that game by 18. Kind of interesting, probably not the right word, maybe sad. The Blazers have only been favorites in 3 games this season, and they have failed to cover in all 3 of those games. And in 2 of those games, they actually lost, and they lost by a lot in both of 2 of those 3 games. They lost by quite a bit to the Nets. They lost by quite a bit to the Jazz. And then the other time they were favored was also at home versus the Jazz. They ended up winning that game, but they didn't cover. I think they were favored by like 7. I think they won by 6 or something like that. As for their season win projection, Trailblazers now have 13 wins, which means they're 57% of the way to hitting the over of their win projection of 22.5 wins, which was set by the folks in Las Vegas prior to the start of the season. So the Blazers ahead of schedule, so they are 57% of the way to hitting the over after 48% of the season. I believe they're at 39 games right now, 41 being the halfway mark, so just about ready to the halfway mark, but they're more than halfway on the way to hitting that over, though, as I've mentioned multiple times, things typically start to get more difficult as the season goes on, as teams in the playoff hunt are playing better basketball. So we'll see if they're able to keep that, if they're able to stay ahead of schedule, I guess is what I would say. it only takes a couple games to fall behind schedule on that thing, particularly when you're talking about, 23 wins, what they have to try to get to in order to hit that over. But as of right now, the over is still looking good. As I mentioned, 57% of the way to hitting the over after 48% of the Portland season. And since we haven't checked in on this one in a while, the Blazers are now 26th in both offensive and defensive rating, and they're 28th in net rating. None of those things all that good. However, I will say, and this is kind of small sample size, but still I think worth pointing out, if it feels like the Blazers have been playing a little better basketball in January, which is the way it's felt to me, some of the numbers do bear that out. Portland's offensive rating in 2025 at this point is 18th, and their defensive rating is 24th. So the offense, it feels to me like it's been operating better since 2025, since the calendar turned over, and the efficiency stat says that is true. So as I mentioned, 18th in offensive rating in the month of January thus far, 24th in defensive rating in the month of January, as opposed to being 26th in both offensive and defensive rating throughout the duration of the season. And that's going to do it for this edition of The Briefcase. Thank you so much for joining me. As always, we'll be back later on this week with another edition before we head out on that trip. Hopefully a good game on Thursday, if nothing else, leading in again into a back-to-back versus the Rockets and Bulls. Tickets available for all those games if you want to come check it out. As I mentioned, Thursday night's game is the Shade and Sharp Collectible Glass Night. And then, a couple back-to-back against a couple good teams in the Bulls and Rockets. All those games on KATU 2.2 and Blazer Vision as well. Thank you for joining me on this edition of The Briefcase presented by Spirit Mountain Casino. I'm Casey Holdahl. Go Blazers.